Colleagues, friends, guests, I'm delighted and flattered that so many of you have come along this evening. When I decided I'd offer a lecture on history, the prospects seemed both energising and refreshing. Now I'm afraid it seems rather like a vain conceit, a bit like a player recalled for a European fixture, lacking match fitness and having lost both pace and vision. Moreover, doing history is difficult. Gustave Flaubert, who wrote the greatest of all historical novels, described doing history as being like drinking an ocean and pissing a cupful. On this ratio, I fear you can't expect much. Now, in this university, of all universities, you all know that there are many wonderful passages in David Lodge novels, but no character perhaps so enduring as Maurice Zapp. For those of you who don't know, Maurice Zapp embodied everything most academics aspire to: international travel, fame, money, cars, sheer intellectual virtuosity. He also embodied a few other things as well, but they would hardly be commended by a modern Vice-Chancellor or condoned by our human resources strategy. Maurice Zapp was, initially at least, the Jane Austen man, internationally feted as the leading authority on the English author. Zapp was, in fact, Lodge tells us, writing a series of commentaries on Jane Austen, saying absolutely everything that could be said about them. The idea was to be absolutely exhausted, to examine the novels from every conceivable angle: historical, biographical, rhetorical, mythical, Freudian, Jungian, existentialist, Marxist, structuralist, Christian allegorical, ethical, exponential, linguistics, phenomenological, archetypical, you name it. So when the commentary would be written, there would be nothing further to say about the novel in question. The object of the exercise was not to enhance others' enjoyment of Jane Austen, still less to honour the novelist herself, but to put a definitive stop to the production of garbage on the subject. Now, I invoke the ever-entertaining spectre of Maurice Zapp because where he succeeded, I failed. I have never, I think, put a stop to the production of any garbage on any research subject. More seriously, at least when I was trying to present myself as a researcher, I could never say anything as pithy as Maurice Zapp's being the Jane Austen man. I was briefly the Robert Southey man, but unfortunately few people had heard of him, so it didn't quite have Zapp's Jane Austen resonance. There is now, I'm pleased to say, a small industry working on Robert Southey, so perhaps I didn't labour in vain. I may yet become the Robert Peel man, which has more of a future, but my biography language is half finished. For much of my career, when I was asked what I did, in other words, what I researched, I offered the kinds of academic answers which cause other people's eyes to glaze over. Central and local government relations in the 19th century, welfare policy, penal policy, the British response to the French Revolution, electoral culture, the development of parliamentary processes, information in the English state, the electoral poll books, or, if I wanted to sound truly audacious, intellectual history. Answering this way didn't always lead to conversational takeoff. Oddly, no one at a dinner party has ever asked me for my views on the difficulties of rating stock in trade in the 1840s, or even my pioneering work which established the daily rate charged by barristers working on royal commissions in the 1830s. There's only one person in the world who knows more about controlling the pace of voting in the unreformed electoral system, but even that tends to impede conversation. Occasionally, I had a hit. I dazzled everyone at an RAE review group dinner at Gareth Roberts' house in 2003 by being the only person to know the date of the first hot air balloon flight in Britain, 1784 in Oxford by James Sadler, a wine merchant, for those who are interested. Now, if that's not a definition of four-star quality, I don't know what is. Then, in the late 1980s and 1990s, like many historians, and not just historians of England, I realised I did have an overarching subject. I worked on the state. This turned out to be really handy. And when I asked what I did, I could now say simply that I worked on the state. which was simultaneously clear and intelligible and had the added advantage of sounding important. To this add the debate on national identities, the controversy on Britishness, an ESRC grant, a list of relevant publications, and I could also claim to become a historian of the British state. Had my career not taken a different turn, I would have continued to work within that broad framework. What is interesting actually about this intellectual autobiography is that many of us trod a similar path and came to see state formation, systems of power, and political and public cultures, not just as the central organising themes of our work, but more profoundly of the realities that shape us as historians and as citizens. In this process that I'm describing, something important happened to the discipline of history. In the 1960s and 1970s, history fragmented. It fragmented through the opportunities offered by relatively easy funding and the opportunities created by the expansion of higher education in the developed world. Our version of professionalisation was atomisation. History became not an integrative discipline, but was in danger of fragmenting into a series of sub-disciplines, not just political, social, diplomatic and economic history, or ancient, medieval, early modern and modern history, but labour history, urban history, women's history, socialist history, local history, international history, rural history, environmental history. And that list is not exhaustive. All these subspecialisms were sustained by their own infrastructures, journals, conferences, and in some cases, even separate history departments in the same institution. Of course, good work was done, and of course, some of this corrected an earlier ascendancy of a narrow political and diplomatic history. But it robbed history as a discipline of its integrative character, and it made it much more difficult for history to communicate. The discipline lost readers, and it was in danger of losing resonance. What's happened in history, of course, has more or less exact parallels in other academic disciplines. And against this background, many of us wanted to see history as a more integrated discipline and found ourselves attracted to major themes, the state, ideas, public and political cultures, as a way not just of bringing history back together, but also as ways of enabling us to look at long-run historical developments. So what I want to explore this evening is cast in precisely this mode. I will range well outside my period, modern Britain, but what I hope to develop is an argument about British state formation which has profound significance for the nature and future direction of the British state. This will be a play in 3 acts. I want to talk about the interplay of 3 states: the English state, which essentially has Anglo-Saxon roots, the British Unionist state, created in and after 1707, and the hybrid state we are in the process of creating through devolution on one hand and European integration on the other. It is a commonplace amongst historians that England is a long-formed state. In contrast to most other modern states, the English state was shaped by a process of evolutionary continuity rather than revolutionary discontinuity. Most modern states can point to moments of foundation or refoundation. The United States hallows its revolution of 1776 and its constitution of 1787. France hallows its revolution of 1789 and the many revivals of that great drama, 1830, 1848, 1871, 1958 and 1968, to name but a few. Many states, notably Germany and Japan, were effectively refounded after 1945. And much of Europe forged new institutions and identities after the Velvet, and in some places actually rather violent revolutions unleashed in 1989. In this context, Britain looks very different, long-formed indeed. Most of our central institutions are medieval in origin, and much that shapes the way our political culture works was determined long before the last century. True, we have had our revolutions, notably between 1642 and 1689. But generally, English political and social institutions have been sufficiently robust to prevent rebellions becoming revolutions. Broadly speaking, revolutions occur when political and social systems collapse, as in France before 1789. Thus, revolutions are not created by revolutionaries, rather revolutionary processes give birth to revolutionaries. Lack of time prevents me from developing this idea, but the point I want to make is that the absence of revolution from English political history tells us something about the resilience of English political and public institutions. I don't offer this as a value judgment. Indeed, those who follow what I'm saying carefully may conclude that revolutions energize and democratize. Rather, I offer the absence of revolution in England as a prism on a distinctive history, a history that historians of both the left and the right have tended to see as English exceptionalism. So let us examine this English exceptionalism. The central political dynamic of medieval states was the struggle to define the role of the crown. Broadly speaking, monarchs sought to concentrate power in their person and in institutions which articulated that personal authority. Opponents of centralised monarchy, first nobles and later more popular movements, sought to distribute power more broadly, constraining monarchical absolutism in the process. Historians of Anglo-Saxon England now paint a picture of a powerful state with developed institutions both to govern and to tax. Before 1066, the English county system was established, counties were subdivided into hundreds and parishes, and a system of local government was firmly established. Sheriffs were appointed from the early 11th century, and the Anglo-Saxon monarchy from Alfred onwards could articulate its power through its ability to impose law and extract taxation. This, in fact, modifies an older narrative of English state formation, a narrative in which it was the Norman invasion of 1066 that led to the development of a strong state. Rather, what happened after 1066 was the fusion of an already formed and functioning English state with a Norman crown which was committed to the further centralisation of power. The famous Doomsday Survey of 1786 was not the first assessment of taxable wealth, but rather was the most sophisticated of a series, and interestingly was probably conducted by Anglo-Saxon officials for a new and ambitious Norman monarchy. The system of government was then refined, notably under Henry II, with the codification of law and a much closer control of sheriffs, jurors, coroners, and other local officials. The incorporation of boroughs and other bodies also reminded subjects of the king's power, while simultaneously recognising the authority of other agencies within the state. This process culminated in the creation in 1381 of the Commissions of Peace and the formalisation of law officers as justices of the peace. The system thus created has been called local government at the king's command, a system in which the king appointed local officials and their authority rested precisely on their being the king's representatives. Law was the royal will, and taxation the means through which monarchical power was both articulated and substantiated. Nevertheless, and importantly, England's social geography, the slow pace of communication, ensured that much power was effectively decentralised. The king's authority in the counties rested in a landed nobility, itself powerful and ambitious. In this system, monarchical power was exercised through, and thus to some extent mediated by, a landed elite. Moreover, monarchical power in medieval England was not untrammelled. The kings ruled by right, but they recognised that might was not necessarily right. Some elements hinted even at a weak contract between the king and his subjects. For example, there were coronation charters, which, although premised on the king's right to rule, acknowledged the subject's right to be ruled well. Of course, not all kings ruled well, and the English aristocracy, even leavened with a substantial infusion of Norman blood, was not prepared simply to be an arm of the executive. Land, wealth, and office led the aristocracy to expect power, and the power of local elites could only be increased at the expense of diminishing that of the crown. Hence, in the long run, there was a struggle to define and to limit the power of the English crown. We see this in the Civil War of Stephen's reign, 1135 to 54, in the Magna Carta of 1215, which was reissued 4 times in the next 22 years, in the baronial rebellion led by Simon de Montfort between 1258 and 1265, in the Wars of the Roses of the 15th century, and in the peasant uprisings of 1381 and 1450. What emerges from these often violent political confrontations was a distribution of power in which both social elites, the aristocracy and the landed gentry, and incorporated institutions, boroughs, city companies, and the key professions, such as clergy and lawyers, all enjoyed substantial power. By the late medieval period, England was thus set on a course which would make the achievement of royal absolutism profoundly improbable, however much the Tudors and the Stuarts might wish it otherwise. As things turned out, the English monarchy had 2 crippling limitations to its power. It lacked money, and it was trammelled by the common law. Lacking wealth, the crown was almost wholly reliant on taxation. From time to time, this could be supplemented by plunder, but generally the costs outweighed the benefits, as in conquering Wales and trying to do the same in France. Just occasionally, the crown got a brutal windfall, as when it secularised and sequestrated most church property through the English Reformation in the 16th century. In this, the English monarchy was truly ahead of its time. Most European monarchies wouldn't raid church wealth until the 18th century, and the French needed a revolution before they did. Still, being precocious in seizing church wealth underlines the English crown's desperate need for cash. The king's inability to live off his own had profound implications for the development of Parliament. The common law, too, is important in England's exceptionalism. We will return to this later, but the point I want to register here is that, from the medieval period, English lawyers and English law had developed a way of making law without direct reference to statute. Some of the developments and conflicts we have been exploring can be paralleled throughout medieval Europe. The struggle to define and extend royal power, the need to raise revenue, the development of systems of law, and the emergence of systems of central and local government. What was different in England was the Crown's relative lack of resources and, as a direct consequence, the development of a powerful parliament. Most European medieval states had their estates, effectively parliaments of landed elites. Throughout the early modern period, there were persistent conflicts between the Crown and estates in much of Europe. The struggle between the Crown and Parliament in England was no different, except in one key respect: the result. Parliament emerged in the ascendant, a victory that has more or less defined everything about the modern English and British state. The details of this struggle are too complex for me to explore here, but let me give you a few pointers. It is often said that Henry VIII demonstrated his power by compelling Parliament to legislate the English Reformation through a series of statutes from 1530 onwards. Now, it is true that Henry used Parliament and broadly secured through Parliament the outcome he sought. But the price was to make Parliament the central agency of legitimacy in the English state. The king was now supreme head of the church, and England a reformed country in breach of Rome. Why? Because Parliament said it was. The ironic outcome of legislating the King's will in the 1530s was that Parliament gained the authority to legislate later to limit the Crown's power. The outcome of the Reformation was thus an augmentation of Parliament's role and power, not just legislating for the structure and liturgy of the Church, but also, under Elizabeth I, carrying through a whole raft of social legislation and welfare, public order and policing. And we see the development through parliamentary statutes of a secular policy for the first time in European history. Thus it was Parliament, building on local experiments, which through Acts of 1597 and 1601 established the English Poor Laws. This was an unprecedented development in Europe, enabling local government to raise rates to support the poor. This, I argued on a number of occasions, laid the basis of the first English welfare state, which flourished until Parliament changed policy in 1834. My main point here simply is that the 16th century saw Parliament rise dramatically in power, scope and ambition. This, of course, intensified the conflict between Parliament and the Crown, a conflict that culminated in the 17th century and was resolved decisively in the 18th. The Stuarts first tried to manage or intimidate Parliament, and then, after 1629, to dispense with it altogether. The result truly was a revolution, with the period 1642 to 1660 seeing Parliament's position secured through civil war and a radical reformation taken to lengths that England, though not as it turned out America, found unacceptable. When the Stuarts were reminded of the lessons of the Civil War in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the modern English state began to take shape. A new monarchy in the person of William III was imported, and Parliament legislated to make itself indispensable. Briefly too, a truly popular politics flourished, with the electorate more representative in the period 1694 to 1715 than it would be in any period before 1867. The minor point I want to make about the establishment of the primacy of Parliament is that it was a far from consensual process. Indeed, it had been contested over 4 centuries. So those who celebrate the genius of the English Constitution and assume an easy evolution of the English state construct English history through a very soft focus lens. The major point I want to make concerns the profound centrality of Parliament to the history of England's state formation. By the 19th century, and especially when the House of Commons reformed itself in 1832, Parliament was arriving at a point where its power was quite unchecked. 2 years after the Great Reform Act of 1832, the King dismissed a ministry for the last time, only to have it foisted back on him by the electorate the following year. And in those same 2 years, 1832 to 1834, Parliament underscored its power by transforming local government through the reform of the Poor Law and the reform of English municipal boroughs. Thus a process began which a Parliament unfettered either by royal power or the ancient fabric of local institutions or by a written constitution drove a kind of parliamentary centralisation that, by 1997, had made Britain perhaps the most centralised polity in Europe. Not only was political and administrative power increasingly focused through parliamentary centralism, but England's Parliament was unfettered either by a constitution or by an established framework through which the rights of citizens were elaborated. Here, I think, is a crucial parting of the ways between England and Europe, and that crucial parting of the ways came in the 18th century. As we've already seen, the central dynamic of politics in 18th century England was the triumph of Parliament. The states of Western Europe, though, energised by the European Enlightenment, moved onto a quite different trajectory in which law mattered more than the states. In Europe, notably in Germany, the Habsburg Empire and Russia before 1789, and France after 1789, states embarked on hugely ambitious codifications of their legal systems. Precisely because political institutions, and in particular popular political institutions, were weaker in Europe, Enlightenment thinkers invested their reforming energies in rethinking and reconfiguring the relationship between the state, the law, and the citizen. In Europe, citizens whose political rights were limited were increasingly empowered by legal rights. Put simply, the definition of citizenship was as much legal as it was political. The use of legal codes and courts to define, enforce, and extend citizens' rights was driven forward in Europe in the 19th century, especially before and after the revolutions of 1848. And, of course, it was imported into the constitution and political culture of the European Union. So if we ask why the European Union places such emphasis on codes and extending the legal rights of citizens, consumers, and workers, and sees European law as an agency of political modernisation, the answer is that this has been central to Western European political culture for more than 250 years. This is not to say that the European tradition has been indifferent to political rights, to securing the right to vote and other forms of political participation, but rather it is to say that in Europe, political rights, in particular just having the vote, has never been regarded as sufficient. Moreover, as Europe democratised, it did so around notions of the sovereignty of the people, a tradition from Rousseau onwards which sees sovereignty residing in the citizen body and represented both through political and legal rights. The difference between this and the English parliamentary tradition is stark. In England, conservatives and radicals have regarded Parliament as sufficient and have been content to see citizenship defined simply in terms of political rights, and indeed more or less exclusively in terms of the right to vote. Thus, the English radical tradition, whether it be the English Jacobins of the 1790s, the Chartists of the 1840s, the Labour Party after 1900, or the suffragettes in the Edwardian period, all of these reforming radical movements have defined their objectives in terms of securing the vote and effective parliamentary power. They have sought access to the parliamentary club. Like their conservative critics, they shared a profound reverence for Parliament as an institution and saw progressive political agendas as being best realised through having and exercising parliamentary power. Hence, and this is crucial, both conservatives and radicals are united in their belief in the sovereignty of Parliament. Note that. It's such a commonplace in English politics and political language that we often don't forget just how important it is. We operate and have operated for over 3 centuries with a notion that Parliament, or more strictly, the Crown in Parliament, is sovereign. Contrast Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment European traditions of the sovereignty of the people. In the European and the American tradition, sovereignty is dispersed and embodied in the people. In England, sovereignty is concentrated and embodied in Parliament. Rights in England are the rights Parliament chooses to legislate. There are no rights in England that exist as prior constitutional rights, nothing that Parliament can't legislate away, and no Parliament can bind its successors, and no rights can thus endure for more than 5 years. English law carries its authority from one Parliament to another because the Parliament of the day has chosen not to repeal or amend it, and therefore it still constitutes the will of Parliament. I know that the European Convention on Human Rights, now incorporated, might look a bit different, but I don't think it really disturbs the point I am making, not least because most still believe the Westminster Parliament can legislate it away. This helps to explain so much that puzzles our European partners and indeed our American friends. Further European integration, strengthening the European Parliament and devolving the power to the various territories of the UK is generally resisted, where it is resisted, on the grounds that it will diminish the sovereignty of Parliament. By which it is meant that Parliament will be less powerful or subject to more significant checks. If you believe in the sovereignty of Parliament, you can see why this should be a concern. However, if you're the product of a different history of state formation, notably one which is grounded in the idea of a constitution and a formal codification of the relationship between governed and the governed, then creating new institutions, sharing power in new ways, need not diminish the sovereignty of the people. Indeed, it may enrich it or give it better expression. If you want to know why so many in this country look with scepticism at the future of Europe, then you need to attend to our history. All of this is underpinned by a tradition of English constitutional thought that gives a theoretical explanation of the centrality of Parliament. At its core is what I've called the doctrine of the sufficiency of Parliament. You can see this very clearly in what is still the classic text of the English parliamentary tradition, Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, first published in 1867. Bagehot wrote in part to refute John Stuart Mill's On Representative Government of 1861, which had been heavily influenced by the French liberal tradition of Mill's friend Alexis de Tocqueville. Mill was a reformer, pressing for a reform of the franchise, local government and the law. Bagehot saw this not only as wrong-headed and dangerous, but as un-English and a misreading of how the English Parliament worked. Bagehot's central contention was that, to understand the English Constitution, you had to look not at how it was formally constituted, but how it worked. He then proceeded to offer a brilliantly perceptive account of how Parliament worked. Theoretical accounts from Montesquieu in the 18th century, had, Bagehot showed, simply misread the English Constitution. They, Montesquieu and his followers, had assumed that it was a balanced constitution, carefully balancing the political power between the Commons and the Lords, balancing executive power between the Crown and the Cabinet, and balancing legal power between Parliament and the judiciary. In practice, as Bagehot showed, there was no such balance. The House of Commons dominated the legislative process, and the Cabinet, a formally unconstitutional body, dominated the executive. To adapt Bill Clinton's famous aphorism, if you ask what British politics is about, it's the Parliament, stupid. Parliament is equally central to the second state I want to talk about, the British state, constructed in and after 1707, the date of the Act of Union with Scotland. If we look at the way in which the British state was put together, it was put together through acts of union between the various countries which came to make up the United Kingdom. The first such union came with the Acts of Union with Wales in 1536 and 1543. Significantly, these Acts of Union were part of the development in the legislative scope of Parliament which we saw earlier. A newly empowered Parliament became the way in which the territory of the English state could be extended. The key shift in thinking within British unionism came in the 17th century. In 1603, when James VI of Scotland succeeded to the English crown, there was a thin constitutional compromise. What emerged in 1603 was a union of the crowns, because it was thought a full union of the parliaments and state institutions would be too complex to bring off. Scotland and England had different religious establishments, different legal systems, different systems of local government, different approaches to education, and different systems of currency, weights, and measures. The list was endless. In 1603, it was thought that a union of parliaments could not be affected or effective without a fusion of political, religious and legal institutions. The sheer scale of an integration of diverse institutions prevented parliamentary union. By 1707, it became clear, or at any rate thinkable, to have a union at parliamentary level without uniformity in public, ecclesiastical, juridical and educational institutions. True, the circumstances were different. By the 1690s, opinion in lowland Scotland was pressing hard for access to English markets. Scottish investors had speculated recklessly. And after a century punctuated by profound unrest, politicians in London eagerly sought ways of stabilising Scotland. Nevertheless, what emerged in 1707 was a solution whose dramatic simplicity was only made possible because Parliament had established a primacy by 1707, which it had not secured in 1603. In 1707, Scotland retained a different established church, a different legal system, and a different educational system, and a different system of local government. Nevertheless, and despite all of that, there was a union of parliaments, with the Edinburgh Parliament being dissolved and Scottish members taking their place at Westminster. Britain was being built not around establishing uniformity in church, law and local government, but through a fusion at the one level that really mattered, Parliament. The same kind of parliamentary union was effected with Ireland a century later. Faced with the challenge of Irish radicalism, massive civil unrest in 1798, and a major crisis wrought by the war with revolutionary France, London repeated in 1800 the solution of 1707 and drew Ireland into the British Unionist state. Here, the union spanned still greater diversity, drawing a Catholic country with a largely peasant economy into a predominantly Protestant nation in the midst of economic modernisation through an industrial and commercial revolution. Thus, Parliament became the fulcrum of Britain as a unionist state. Without the prior victory of the English Parliament, the British state would have been unthinkable, at least in the parliamentary unionist form it took. The key to Britain as a unionist state has been not only a strong parliament, but what I have dubbed the doctrine of the sufficiency of Parliament. Whereas other federations and multi-ethnic states in Europe sought or were forced to accept complex legal and political frameworks within which regional, linguistic and ethnic differences were expressed and enshrined, the British Unionist state took representation in Parliament as a sufficient guarantor of regional, subnational or national identities. By contrast, the Habsburgs held their empire together after 1867 only by dualism, that's to say according the same status to the Austrian lands and to the Hungarian lands. Germany was unified between 1866 and 1871 through a carefully and legally expressed federalism. But Britain simply operated with parliamentary unionism. You're all probably seeing where this argument is leading. The union with Ireland failed. One can analyse that failure in one of two ways. It failed either because the cultural, religious and economic gulfs were too great, or it failed because those differences were insufficiently accommodated within the British parliamentary state. The point is either that there are differences which parliamentary unionism cannot span without collapsing, or that too thin a notion of unionism took root, in which differences were squeezed rather than accommodated. Significantly, the experiment that was not tried with Ireland in 1886, 1893 and 1914 was trying to stabilise the parliamentary union by the creation of a national sub-parliament in Ireland. This, of course, is precisely what Parliament did do a century later for the other territories of the UK. And through devolution in 1998, the attempt to stabilise what now remains of the Union by the creation of sub-parliaments or assemblies is what devolution is substantially about. We are now exploring the boundaries of a unionist state. Whether and how it might survive are interesting and indeed in Scotland urgent questions. The centrifugal forces are considerable. The most obvious, of course, is that nationalist languages demand political and cultural spaces for nations to function as nations. The most interesting facet to me, though, is the problem of Britain's highly distinctive parliamentary history. Our parliamentary system and our parliamentary language struggles with notions of power where power is distributed. The sufficiency and central power of the British Parliament has left British political culture with an impoverished notion of the ways in which power might beneficially be distributed. We think in terms of conflicts between parliamentary and quasi-parliamentary institutions, not in terms of their complementarities. Hence also the need for a strictly limited and subordinated second chamber at Westminster without the capacity to invoke significant representative legitimacy. The attempt to reform the House of Lords has gone on for over a century and is not, and I submit, will not be completed. In this context, too, we might note that the electoral systems established in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were devised to deliver minority, or at best, slender majority administrations. If we had a richer language of and a greater sympathy for federalism, the question of Scottish independence might not have risen, or at least it might not have arisen in the stark separatist form that it is now presenting. My central point here, though, is that our reliance on the language and the idea of a central mediating parliamentary system is impoverishing. Moreover, working a multi-parliamentary system in a unionist framework is formidably difficult. Or, to put it more bluntly, it will be difficult to operate a quasi-federal devolved system without establishing the United Kingdom formally as a federalist state. That is not, however, to say that the territories of the UK would or will choose independence over union. Money has always mattered here. It mattered to the Scots in the early 18th century when they sought union with England. It continues to matter to the Welsh, and it will probably be decisive with the Scots in the September 2014 referendum. The need to create appropriate frameworks for regional differences and multicultural politics may point in the same direction. Thus, I want to submit, federalism rather than unionism may yet be the future of the UK. The British like to pride themselves on being different, a mature people long formed through a distinctive and distinguished national history. This emphasis on the difference of Britain and Britishness is a commonplace of British politics, a truism of British popular culture, and the driving force of much academic scholarship. It is, of course, also deeply irritating to many of our European partners, problematic in an increasingly devolved UK, and troubling for any of us who want to think of ourselves as primarily European. Invoking Britishness is pervasive. Defining it is problematic. John Major, when Prime Minister, tried. All that's now remembered is claptrap about warm beer and village cricket. Where I was born, beer is cellar temperature when we play league cricket. But Major's dilemma was characteristic of British politicians. They don't want to relinquish Britishness, but they struggle to define it. I was at a meeting in 2001 when a minister sought to define Britishness. She fell into a concatenation of easy, if infuriating, cliches. Britishness was about democracy, decency, fair play, social justice, and a sense of community. I wanted to scream in protest. All of this is true, but none of it is distinctively British. In European terms, in fact, democracy came late to Britain. 1918 or 1928, if you think women matter. The same may be said of social justice, if by that we mean fiscal redistribution, social insurance, or legal protection of individual rights. The simple elision of Britishness and liberal democracy will not do, partly because it puts the soft mood music of cultural evocation before the horse of fierce ideological contestation, and partly because Britishness has often been about quite different agendas: imperialism, a restrictive franchise, and cultural intolerance. Moreover, as we have seen, Britain was, in its origins, a political and not a cultural construction. What often looked like the cultural preconditions for British parliamentary centralism, Protestantism, imperialism, and the ability to wage patriotic war successfully, were in fact consequences of a powerful parliamentary centralism. Nevertheless, Parliament and the construction of the British state are not immune from cultural challenge and cultural reformation. A post-Christian, post-imperial, multicultural polity is very different from the political culture characteristic of Britain's long-formed, historically centralised parliamentary state. The rise, rediscovery, and indeed the fabrication of national, regional and sub-national identities are underpinning a fragile experiment in a devolved polity which is ultimately eschewing the stabilising forces of constitutional federalism. This, and our highly ambivalent relationship to Europe, have meant that the constitutional and political arrangements of the UK are now more uncertain than at any time in the last 3 centuries. The European Union has a term for the kind of constitutional settlement we might be elaborating. It's called variable geometry. But we're trying to do this so far without elaborating anything approaching federalism. Where the gears of the system grind, we still invoke the primacy of the Westminster Parliament. At the same time, we're pushing the limits of a unionist state. Britishness will only survive if the British state continues to comprehend the increasing diversity of the British state. Just as the creation of the British state formed Britishness, so the disillusionment of the British state would leave Britishness not only stateless, but meaningless. So ironically, the future of the British state is perhaps most likely to be as a federal state. Britishness could, and perhaps already is, mutating into a quasi-federal identity. There is, however, little in the history of Britain and Britishness to help us forge a federal future. And if that is indeed the trajectory of our future, we will need to look to Europe to chart the ways forward. If that happens, the history of British exceptionalism, and with it the remarkable role Parliament has played in our English unionist and imperial state, will then have run its course. Thank you.